Title: Real-Life Mystery and History of Titanic. Welcome, dear listeners and learners. Today, we begin a long story about one of the most famous ships in history, the Titanic. This story is not only about a ship. It is about dreams, emotions, courage, and mystery. It will help you practice English listening, learn new vocabulary, and understand everyday expressions in a natural way. So, sit back, relax, and let's start our journey together. In the early years of the 20th century, the world was changing very quickly. New inventions, new machines, and new hopes filled people's lives. Cities were growing, factories were working, and people dreamed of traveling faster and farther than ever before. At this time, ships were the most powerful way to connect countries. Airplanes were not yet common, and people who wanted to cross the ocean had only one choice: to take a ship. Among the shipping companies, one name was strong and famous: the White Star Line. This company wanted to build the largest, most luxurious, and safest ships the world had ever seen. The leaders of the company believed that travel across the Atlantic Ocean could be not only fast but also beautiful, rich, and full of comfort. And so, the dream of the Titanic was born. The Titanic was built in Belfast, a city in Northern Ireland. Thousands of workers spent more than 2 years building the great ship. They worked in shipyards with the sound of hammers, saws, and heavy metal tools. The ship was made of millions of parts: steel plates, iron bolts, wooden floors, and shining glass windows. The Titanic was not just big. It was the largest moving object on Earth at that time. It was almost 270 meters long and 28 meters wide. Its weight was more than 46,000 tons. It was truly a giant. But the Titanic was not only strong. It was also beautiful. Inside, the ship looked like a floating palace. There were wide staircases, shining chandeliers, soft carpets, and elegant dining rooms. There were private cabins for the rich, with furniture like hotels on land. For the middle-class passengers, there were clean and comfortable rooms. Even the third-class passengers, who usually had the hardest travel conditions, found Titanic better than many other ships. People said the Titanic was unsinkable. They believed that no accident, no storm, no damage could destroy it. The ship had special doors inside that could close if water entered. These watertight doors were meant to keep the ship safe, even if part of it was damaged. The newspapers called it the Ship of Dreams. And many people agreed. In 1912, the Titanic was ready for its first voyage. The plan was simple but exciting. The ship would leave Southampton, England, and travel across the Atlantic Ocean to New York, America. This journey was not just travel. It was a symbol of new life, new opportunities, and new beginnings. Many rich passengers wanted to enjoy the luxury of the ship. They wanted to eat the finest food, walk on the grand decks, and talk with other important people. At the same time, many poor passengers were traveling to America for a different reason. They wanted to start a new life. They wanted jobs, freedom, and hope. For them, the Titanic was not a palace, it was a doorway to their dreams. On the morning of April 10, 1912, hundreds of people arrived at the port of Southampton. The weather was fresh, the sky was clear, and excitement filled the air. Families hugged each other. Children laughed and pointed at the great ship. Some people cried because they were saying goodbye to loved ones. Others smiled with joy, ready for adventure. The Titanic stood tall in the water, shining with pride. Its 4 great smokestacks rose into the sky. Its decks were full of crew members preparing for the journey. As passengers entered the Titanic, they were amazed. The first-class passengers walked through grand halls with polished wood, golden decorations, and shining lights. They saw the famous grand staircase, with its elegant railings and glass dome above. It looked more like a royal palace than a ship. In the second-class areas, passengers found clean rooms, comfortable beds, and pleasant dining spaces. For many of them, it was the best travel experience they had ever had. In third class, families and workers discovered simple but safe cabins, shared rooms, and dining halls where they could eat together. Even though it was not luxurious, it was better than what most immigrants had known before. The ship was alive with sound, the laughter of children, the voices of families, the footsteps of passengers exploring, the music of a small band playing cheerful tunes. People felt they were part of something historic. They were not just passengers, they were witnesses to the beginning of a legend. For the passengers, emotions were mixed. Some were excited, some were nervous, and some felt both at the same time. A rich lady whispered to her friend, "This ship is more beautiful than any hotel I have ever seen." A young man from Ireland, traveling in third class, told his brother, "America is waiting for us. This ship will carry us to a new life." A small child looked at the grand staircase and asked, "Is this a castle, Mama?" Even the crew members felt special. Many of them believed they were working on the safest ship in the world. They walked with pride, wearing their uniforms and helping passengers. At noon on April 10th, the Titanic's horn blew loudly. The sound echoed across the port, shaking the air. Slowly, the ship began to move. Families on the shore waved goodbye, shouting names and sending love. People on the ship waved back, throwing handkerchiefs and hats in the air. The Titanic moved gracefully out of Southampton. It was like watching a giant bird take flight for the first time. For many, this moment was unforgettable. The journey had begun. As the Titanic sailed into the open sea, people's dreams traveled with it. A young couple in first class dreamed of a honeymoon in New York. A businessman carried important papers, hoping for big deals in America. A poor family from Eastern Europe prayed for a new life without hunger. A group of Irish workers sang songs on deck, happy to be going to a land of opportunity. The ship carried not only bodies, but also hearts full of hope, fear, love, and dreams. On the first evening, the passengers enjoyed dinner. The dining halls were filled with delicious smells, roasted meat, fresh bread, warm soup, and sweet desserts. The first-class passengers had 10 courses of fine food, served by polite waiters. In second and third class, the meals were simpler but satisfying. After dinner, people walked on the decks, watching the sunset over the ocean. The air was cool, the sea was calm, and the Titanic moved smoothly across the water. Someone said, "This ship is so strong. It feels like we are walking on land." Another person laughed, "Nothing can happen to the Titanic. It is unsinkable." These words made many people feel safe. But history would later show a different truth. The Titanic had begun its first and last journey. The passengers were filled with hope and excitement. The ship was filled with laughter, music, and the sound of dreams. No one knew what was waiting ahead in the dark ocean. No one imagined that the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, would face the most famous disaster in history. But for now, the story was full of joy, safety, and belief in a bright future. The Titanic had left Southampton and was moving toward the open Atlantic Ocean. The air was fresh, the sea was calm, and the passengers were ready for adventure. For many of them, it was their very first time traveling on such a grand ship. Everywhere on board, people were talking, walking, laughing, and exploring. The Titanic was more than just transportation. It was a floating city, a place where people ate, slept, played, and dreamed together. The ship carried over 2,200 people, passengers and crew combined. Each of them had a different story, a different reason for being there. For the wealthy passengers, life on the Titanic felt like living inside a palace. They could spend their time in smoking rooms, libraries, cafes, and the famous Grand Dining Hall. The dining hall itself was larger and more beautiful than many hotels on land. Tall windows let in soft light. White tablecloths covered the tables. Shining silverware and crystal glasses sparkled under the glow of chandeliers. At mealtimes, the first-class passengers enjoyed foods that most people had never even seen. There were oysters, roasted duck, lamb with mint sauce, asparagus, peaches and jelly, and rich chocolate desserts. Some meals had more than 10 courses, each served slowly, with style. As they ate, the passengers spoke about business, politics, art, and travel. Some bragged about their houses, their wealth, or their adventures in other countries. Others whispered about society news, who was marrying whom, who had lost money, and who was rising in power. For these passengers, the Titanic was not only safe, it was also a stage where they could show their importance. In second class, the experience was quieter but still very comfortable. These passengers were not poor, but they were not rich either. Many of them were teachers, merchants, engineers, or middle-class families. Their dining room was elegant but simpler than the first-class one. The meals were smaller, but still far better than what they would normally have at home. They ate chicken, roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and pudding for dessert. In the evenings, they enjoyed music, reading rooms, or just walking on the deck. Second-class passengers often spoke about education, work, and family life. Some were traveling to America for business, others for study, and a few simply for adventure. They felt proud to be on the Titanic. It was the most famous ship in the world, and they were part of its first voyage. In third class, life was very different, but also full of hope. The third-class passengers were mostly immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. They were poor, but they carried with them the richest treasure, dreams of a better future. For them, the Titanic was a doorway. On the other side of the ocean was America, the land of opportunity. They dreamed of finding jobs, buying land, building homes, and starting new lives. The third-class cabins were simple, with bunk beds and shared bathrooms. There was not much privacy, but they were still clean and safer than many other ships. The food was plain but filling. They ate bread, soup, stew, porridge, and sometimes fruit. It was not fancy, but for many poor families, it was already more than what they usually had. In the evenings, third-class passengers created their own joy. They sang songs, danced to fiddles and accordions, and shared stories of their homelands. Children laughed and ran across the small spaces, while parents watched with tired but hopeful eyes. The atmosphere in third class was filled with energy, warmth, and the sound of everyday people dreaming of tomorrow. Behind the scenes, the crew worked hard to keep the ship running smoothly. There were over 800 crew members, each with different duties. The officers stood on the bridge, guiding the ship across the ocean. The engineers worked deep below, where giant engines and furnaces roared with heat. The stewards and stewardesses cleaned rooms, carried luggage, and served meals. The cooks and bakers prepared thousands of meals every single day. The crew members worked long hours, but many of them felt proud. They believed they were part of history, working on the most famous ship in the world. Some whispered, "This job is hard, but when people hear that I worked on the Titanic, they will respect me." As the Titanic sailed forward, it became a small world of its own. Each class lived differently, but they all shared the same ship and the same ocean. From the top deck, rich ladies in long dresses and wide hats walked slowly, enjoying the fresh air. Gentlemen smoked cigars and discussed money or politics. On the middle decks, children played games, families talked, and young men leaned on the rails, looking at the endless water. On the lower decks, music and laughter rose from third-class gatherings. Voices in many languages, English, Irish, Italian, Swedish, mixed together like music. The Titanic carried not only people, but also the colors, sounds, and emotions of many nations. For the first days, the weather was perfect. The ocean was calm, like a sheet of glass. The sky was blue during the day and filled with stars at night. The ship moved smoothly, almost silently, across the water. Passengers often said, "It feels as if the ship is not moving at all." Some compared it to walking in a hotel corridor. They could hardly believe they were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The calm sea gave everyone a sense of safety. They believed that nothing bad could happen. The Titanic felt like a world separate from danger, a place of peace and comfort. Every passenger had a story, and every story added life to the Titanic. A young Irish girl wrote letters to her family, telling them how wonderful the ship was. An American millionaire sent telegrams to his business partners, planning deals even while at sea. A Swedish family prayed together every evening, asking God to bless their journey. A group of Italian musicians practiced quietly, preparing to play for passengers the next night. The ship was full of emotions, love, worry, laughter, and hope. Still, some people asked questions. They looked at the ship's lifeboats and wondered if there were enough. The Titanic had only 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the people on board. When passengers asked about this, the crew often smiled and replied, "Do not worry. The Titanic is unsinkable. Lifeboats are only here for show." These words calmed many people. Most trusted the ship completely. The idea of danger seemed far away, almost impossible. Each evening, the Titanic felt alive with beauty. In first class, the band played soft music while couples danced slowly. In second class, people listened to piano songs or read books in quiet rooms. In third class, there was singing, clapping, and dancing late into the night. The ship itself seemed like a place of happiness. The passengers were living moments they would remember forever. No one imagined that in only a few days, their songs would turn into cries, and their dreams into tragedy. The Titanic sailed forward, calm and proud. It carried rich and poor, young and old, hopeful and fearful. It carried laughter, music, and love. It carried the dreams of over 2,200 souls across the wide Atlantic. For now, the sea was gentle. The passengers believed the future was bright. They did not know that the calm before them was only the beginning of one of the greatest tragedies in history. The Titanic moved steadily across the Atlantic Ocean. Day after day, the sea stayed calm, like a mirror reflecting the sky. The ship glided forward with ease, and life on board began to feel normal. For many passengers, the excitement of departure slowly turned into routine. They woke up in their cabins, ate meals at the same times, walked the decks, and talked with others. Life on the Titanic became a pattern of small, everyday moments. Some passengers enjoyed the routine because it made them feel safe. Others, especially children, sometimes grew restless. They wanted games, adventures, and something new to see. Still, for almost everyone, the journey felt peaceful, comfortable, and full of promise. In the mornings, the decks were busy. Stewards brought breakfast to the cabins or served it in the dining halls. The smell of coffee, fresh bread, bacon, and eggs filled the air. First-class passengers enjoyed breakfast in bed, reading newspapers or letters. Second-class families gathered together at tables, smiling as they planned their day. Third-class passengers lined up for simple but warm meals, porridge, bread, and tea. After breakfast, many people walked outside. The sea stretched in every direction, endless and blue. The cold Atlantic air touched their faces, but the sun made it gentle and fresh. Children played games like hopscotch or ran along the decks, laughing. Couples strolled arm in arm, speaking softly about their hopes in America. Elderly travelers sat quietly, watching the waves and remembering their lives. As the days passed, strangers became friends. On such a long voyage, people naturally spoke to each other. In first class, men met in the smoking room to play cards and talk about business. Women met in the lounges, sharing stories about fashion, art, or family life. In second class, friendships grew quickly. Many passengers were teachers, doctors, or professionals. They often discussed education, inventions, or the beauty of the sea. In third class, friendships were even stronger. Families from different countries shared food, songs, and stories. Though they spoke different languages, they found ways to communicate, with smiles, gestures, and laughter. One Irish boy taught an Italian girl a simple song. She laughed as she tried to pronounce the words. In return, she showed him a dance from her village. The deck was alive with these small, human moments. One of the most beloved parts of the Titanic was its music. The ship had a band of talented musicians who played every day. They performed in the first-class lounge, the dining hall, and even on deck when the weather was fine. The sound of violins, cellos, and pianos floated through the air. The music made passengers feel relaxed, happy, and elegant. In third class, the passengers created their own music. They sang folk songs in Irish, Italian, and Scandinavian languages. They clapped, stomped, and laughed as fiddles and accordions played. Music connected everyone. It was the language of joy, and it filled the Titanic with life. Even though life on board seemed perfect, there were small worries. Some passengers wondered about the speed of the ship. The Titanic was moving quickly across the ocean. A few whispered, "Are we going too fast? Shouldn't a new ship be more careful?" Others looked at the cold nights and thought about icebergs. The northern Atlantic was known for floating ice in April. But the officers always reassured them, "The Titanic is unsinkable. There is nothing to fear." Most passengers accepted these words. They wanted to believe in safety, so they pushed their fears aside. While passengers enjoyed music and meals, the crew was busy at work. Deep inside the ship, firemen and stokers fed coal into the huge furnaces. Sweat poured down their faces as they worked in the heat. The engines roared like giants, pushing the ship forward hour by hour. On the bridge, the officers studied maps, compasses, and the stars. They kept careful watch over the direction of the ship. They also received wireless messages from other ships, warning about ice in the area. The warnings were real, but the Titanic kept moving fast. The company wanted to impress the world with speed and luxury. The officers believed the ship was safe enough, even in icy waters. As the sun went down, the Titanic became magical. The lights inside glowed warmly. The chandeliers sparkled, and the ship seemed like a castle floating on the dark sea. In first class, passengers dressed for dinner. Women wore gowns of silk and satin. Men wore tuxedos with bow ties. The meals were long, with laughter, music, and the clink of glasses. In second class, the atmosphere was cheerful but simpler. Families enjoyed roasts, pies, and pudding, talking together about America. In third class, the evenings were lively. Passengers gathered in common rooms, where music and dancing filled the night. They clapped, sang, and told jokes until they were tired. Above all, there was a sense of peace. The ocean was calm, the stars were bright, and the Titanic seemed unstoppable. At night, passengers lay in their cabins, listening to the gentle hum of the engines. The movement of the ship was steady, like a heartbeat. Many people fell asleep quickly, dreaming of their future. A young couple dreamed of their new life as husband and wife in New York. A poor farmer dreamed of owning land and growing crops in America. A rich businessman dreamed of building more companies and becoming more powerful. The Titanic carried not only their bodies, but also their hopes and dreams. Yet, while passengers dreamed, the sea remained wide and mysterious. In the distance, silent icebergs floated in the cold water. They were like white mountains, waiting in the night. The Titanic was strong, fast, and proud. But nature is greater than any machine. The ship's journey through calm waters was leading it slowly toward danger. The passengers did not know it. The crew did not fully believe it. But the calm was only a cover. The storm of fate was waiting, hidden in the darkness. The days on the Titanic were full of peace, laughter, and music. It was a time of routine, joy, and dreams. But beneath the calm, the ocean held secrets. Warnings of ice had already been sent. The ship was moving fast, and the night was growing colder. This was the calm before the storm. Soon, everything would change. It was Sunday, April 14, 1912. The Titanic had been at sea for 4 days. The passengers had enjoyed meals, music, and calm weather. But on this evening, the air grew colder. The ocean looked black and endless under the clear sky. The stars shone brightly above. Some passengers walked on deck and looked up in wonder. One woman whispered, "I have never seen so many stars in my life." The sea was strangely quiet. The water was smooth, almost too smooth. It was like glass, without waves or sound. This silence gave some people peace, but it also gave others a feeling of unease. Still, most passengers did not worry. They believed the Titanic was safe. Inside, the ship was full of life. In the dining rooms, people laughed and enjoyed their dinners. In the lounges, the band played gentle music. In third class, passengers sang folk songs, clapping and stomping their feet. The night felt calm, but the calm was only on the surface. Throughout the day, the wireless operators had received several warnings from other ships. The warnings said, "Icebergs ahead." But the messages were not taken seriously enough. The Titanic continued at full speed, over 22 knots. Some officers on the bridge were watchful. They knew icebergs could be dangerous. But they trusted the ship. They believed it could survive anything. 2 lookouts stood in the crow's nest, high above the deck. Their eyes searched the dark horizon. But they had no binoculars. The night was clear, but the icebergs were hard to see in the starlight. Inside the ship, life continued as normal. In first class, wealthy passengers finished their rich dinners. Some returned to the smoking room for cigars and brandy. Others gathered in the lounge, listening to music or playing cards. In second class, families returned to their cabins. Parents read stories to their children. Some wrote letters, telling relatives how safe and comfortable the Titanic was. In third class, the night was lively. Immigrant families sang, danced, and laughed together. The sound of fiddles and accordions filled the rooms. For many, it was the happiest night of the journey. No one imagined that within hours, their lives would be changed forever. At 11:40 p.m., the lookouts in the crow's nest suddenly saw something. A dark shape rose in the distance. It was large, silent, and shining faintly in the starlight. "Iceberg, right ahead," one lookout shouted. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. The officer on duty reacted quickly. He ordered, "Hard A starboard. Turn the wheel to the left." At the same time, the engines were reversed. The Titanic began to turn, but it was too late. The ship was too big, too fast, and too close to the iceberg. A moment later, the Titanic scraped along the iceberg's side. It was not a loud crash. It was more like a heavy, grinding sound, metal against ice. Some passengers felt only a slight shudder, as if the ship had hit a wave. In first class, a woman asked her husband, "Did we stop?" He replied calmly, "No, dear. Probably nothing at all." In third class, a boy felt his bed shake. He laughed and said, "Maybe we hit a whale." The truth was far worse. The iceberg had torn open several sections of the ship's hull under the waterline. The sea rushed in quickly. At first, most passengers did not know what had happened. The engines stopped, and the ship was very still. People looked at each other, confused. Some went back to bed, thinking it was only a small delay. Others put on coats and went up to the deck to see what was happening. Crew members tried to calm everyone. "There is no danger," they said. "The ship is unsinkable. Please return to your cabins." But below, the engineers already knew the truth. Water was flooding into the ship at an alarming speed. 5 compartments were filling with water. The Titanic could not survive this damage. Captain Edward Smith was called to the bridge. He listened to the officers' reports, his face pale. When he understood the damage, he whispered, "The ship will go down." It was a terrible truth. The unsinkable ship was sinking. He gave orders, "Wake all passengers. Prepare the lifeboats. Send distress signals by wireless." The passengers slowly began to sense the seriousness. Stewards knocked on doors, telling people to put on life vests and come to the boat deck. Some obeyed immediately, pulling on coats and carrying children. Others refused, thinking it was unnecessary. A rich man laughed and said, "I paid good money to travel on this ship, not to sit in a small boat." In third class, confusion was greater. Many passengers did not understand English well. They looked at the crew in fear, not knowing where to go. Mothers held crying children. Fathers tried to stay calm, but their eyes showed worry. At first, the lifeboats were lowered half empty. Many people did not believe the ship was in danger. They preferred to stay on the warm, brightly lit Titanic than sit in the cold, dark sea. One lifeboat that could hold 65 people left with only 28. Another with space for 40 had just 12. The officers shouted, "Women and children first." Some men stepped back bravely, allowing wives and children to leave. Others begged to go, but were pushed away. The deck was now filled with mixed emotions. Some people were calm, holding hands and whispering prayers. Some were angry, demanding answers from the crew. Some were in denial, saying, "This ship cannot sink." Children cried, their small voices rising into the night. The band continued to play music, trying to keep everyone calm. They played cheerful tunes, as if nothing was wrong. Passengers listened, some with tears in their eyes, some with hope. As more water flooded in, the Titanic began to tilt forward. People felt the slope under their feet. Objects slid across floors, dishes crashed in the kitchens. Now the truth was clear, the great ship was sinking. Fear spread quickly. People rushed toward the lifeboats. Crew members struggled to keep order. Voices shouted in many languages: English, Irish, Italian, Swedish, Russian. The night was no longer peaceful. It was filled with chaos, cries, and desperation. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg. By midnight, confusion had spread across the decks. The ship that was called Unsinkable was taking on water. Some passengers still did not believe it. Others already knew they were facing death. The calm ocean and the starry sky hid the tragedy that was beginning. The night of ice had arrived. It was just after midnight, early on Monday, April 15, 1912. The Titanic had already begun to tilt forward as icy water poured into its lower decks. The once proud ship was now heavy with water, its bow sinking deeper every minute. The air outside was freezing. The temperature of the sea was below zero. Anyone who fell in would survive only a few minutes. On deck, passengers crowded together, wrapped in coats, blankets, and life vests. The lifeboats were being prepared, but there were not enough for everyone. This simple fact made the night one of fear, courage, and heartbreaking choices. The officers shouted again and again, "Women and children first." This rule was followed with strictness. Many men had to step aside, even if it meant being separated from their wives and children. One father bent down to his small son and whispered, "Be brave, my boy. Take care of your mother." He kissed his child's forehead and helped them into the lifeboat. Then he stepped back, watching as the boat was lowered away. Some women refused to leave their husbands. One lady cried, "I will not go without him." She clung to her husband's arm, shaking her head. The crew begged her to take a seat. But she chose love over safety. She stayed behind, holding his hand. These moments showed both the strength and pain of the human heart. At first, many lifeboats left half empty. Some passengers still believed the Titanic was safe. Others were too afraid to climb into the small wooden boat swinging high above the Black Sea. One boat that could hold 65 people left with only 28. Another left with space for 30 more. Later, when the truth became undeniable, people fought desperately to reach the last boats. But by then, it was too late for many. Not all men stepped back silently. Some begged and pushed, trying to climb into the boats. But others showed great courage. One gentleman kissed his wife's hand and said calmly, "Go, my dear. I shall follow later." He knew he would not. A group of young crew members worked endlessly, lowering boats, calming passengers, and guiding children. Even though they had little chance of surviving, they did not stop helping. The ship's musicians also showed rare bravery. Instead of running to safety, they kept playing their instruments. They believed music could bring comfort and calm. As chaos grew, they played gentle hymns, filling the cold night with hope. Passengers later remembered hearing the hymn "Nearer, my God, to Thee." The music floated above the cries of fear, a sound of peace in the middle of despair. As the Titanic tilted more sharply, panic began to spread. People rushed across the decks, shouting and crying. Mothers screamed for their children. Men argued with officers, demanding places in the boats. Some tried to hide in the shadows, hoping to slip into a lifeboat unnoticed. One officer fired his pistol into the air, shouting, "Stand back. Women and children first." The sound of the shot silenced the crowd for a moment. Below deck, third-class passengers faced even greater fear. Many did not understand the crew's English orders. Some gates and doors were closed, making it difficult for them to reach the lifeboats. Fathers carried children on their shoulders, pushing through crowded corridors. Mothers cried as cold water began to rise on the floors. The journey to the upper deck was long and frightening. For many, it was too late. By around 2 a.m., only a few lifeboats remained. The Titanic was sinking faster now. Its bow was deep underwater, and its stern, the back of the ship, was rising high. The officers tried to fill the last boats quickly. But the number of people left was too great. Some men begged desperately, "Please, just one more seat." But the boats were already full. Others made brave choices. They stepped back and said, "Go. Save the children." At last, the final lifeboat was lowered. Hundreds of passengers were left standing on the deck, staring into the Black Sea, knowing there was no escape. In those last minutes, many passengers showed the deepest emotions of human life: love, sacrifice, and faith. An old couple sat quietly together, holding hands. They had lived a long life side by side, and they chose to die the same way. A group of priests prayed aloud, giving comfort to the frightened passengers around them. Some parents wrapped children in blankets, whispering, "Don't be afraid. You'll be safe." Then they handed them to strangers in lifeboats, sacrificing their own chance to live. For every act of panic, there was also an act of courage. Through it all, the band never stopped playing. Their music was soft, steady, and full of calm. Passengers said the sound gave them courage, even as fear grew. One survivor later remembered, "The music was the bravest thing I ever heard." The songs reminded people of home, of faith, and of peace beyond the storm. By 2:15 a.m., the Titanic's deck was at a terrifying angle. People struggled to stand as the ship tilted higher and higher. Some slid into the freezing water below. Others clung to the rails, praying or screaming. At 2:18 a.m., the great ship's lights flickered and went out. Darkness covered everything. The only sounds were the cries of people and the roar of the sea. Then, with a thunderous roar, the Titanic broke into two pieces. The bow sank quickly, disappearing under the waves. The stern, still full of people, rose high in the air. For a few seconds, it stood almost vertical against the sky. Then it, too, slid down into the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic was gone. Over 1,500 people were left floating in the freezing water. The temperature was so cold that breath froze in the air. People screamed for help, but the cries grew weaker and weaker. Those in the lifeboats could hear the voices in the darkness. Some begged to return and rescue more. But the officers feared the boats would be overturned by desperate swimmers. Slowly, the cries faded, leaving only silence and the sound of the sea. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship, had sunk beneath the waves. It took with it over 1,500 souls, men, women, and children. But in its final hours, it also revealed the courage, love, and sacrifice of humanity. Some people showed fear, others showed bravery. Some fought for survival, others gave up their places for strangers. The night was full of chaos, but also full of courage. The world would never forget this moment. It was just after 2:20 in the morning. The great ship Titanic was gone, swallowed by the cold Atlantic Ocean. The night sky was filled with stars, bright and silent, but the sea was black, empty, and cruel. All around, small lifeboats floated on the water. Inside them, survivors sat in shock, shivering in the freezing wind. They had just watched the largest, proudest ship in the world sink before their eyes. The silence after the sinking was terrifying. At first, there were loud cries and screams from the water, thousands of voices begging for help. But soon, those voices grew weaker. One by one, they faded away, leaving a silence so heavy that many survivors would remember it for the rest of their lives. The lifeboats drifted across the ocean, scattered and lost. Some carried only half their possible number, with plenty of empty seats. Others were crowded, people pressed close together, trying to stay warm. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering words of comfort, "Don't be afraid, we are safe now." But inside, they were not sure if safety would ever come. Some passengers sat in silence, staring at the black water where their loved ones had disappeared. Others wept quietly, unable to stop their tears. The cold was brutal. Ice formed on clothes and hair. Hands and feet grew numb. Every breath felt like ice in the lungs. One man in a lifeboat said, "I have never known silence so deep, nor a night so endless." A few people were still alive in the freezing water. Some called out for help, their voices weak but desperate. A few lifeboats considered going back to rescue them. One boat, commanded by a brave seaman, did turn around. They managed to pull several half-frozen survivors out of the sea. But for most, it was already too late. The water was like death itself. In just a few minutes, strong men could no longer move their arms. Children slipped quietly into eternal sleep. The ocean had no mercy. The survivors now had only one hope, that another ship would come. They knew Titanic had sent distress signals, the SOS messages by radio. Would anyone answer? Every minute felt like an hour. Some people whispered prayers. Others just stared at the horizon, searching for a light. The children asked, "When will we go home?" But no one had an answer. The lifeboats drifted together at times, then apart again. The sea was calm, but the hearts of the people were stormy with fear. Hours passed. Finally, just before dawn, someone shouted, "A light! A ship!" Far in the distance, a glow appeared on the horizon. It was the Carpathia, a ship that had changed its course and rushed to Titanic's last signal. For the survivors, that tiny light was like a star of hope in the darkest night. As the Carpathia came closer, the people in the lifeboats began to cry, laugh, and pray. They waved, shouted, and tried to row toward the rescue ship. The crew of the Carpathia worked quickly, throwing ropes and ladders to pull the weak and frozen survivors aboard. The rescue was not easy. The sea was still icy, and many survivors were too weak to climb. Crew members carried children up the ladders. Some women fainted as soon as they touched the deck of the Carpathia. Others fell to their knees, kissing the wooden floor in gratitude. Blankets, hot drinks, and food were given to them. Doctors moved quickly, trying to save those half-dead from cold and shock. One woman whispered, "Is this real? Am I alive?" Another cried, "My husband, he was left behind." Her tears fell into the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. As the Carpathia continued to pick up lifeboats, the full horror became clear. There were about 2,200 people on the Titanic. But only about 700 were saved. That meant over 1,500 lives were lost in a single night. The survivors were deeply shaken. Every face they saw reminded them of someone missing. Every child safe on board reminded them of another who had not survived. The decks of the Carpathia were filled with silence and sobbing. The night had stolen fathers, mothers, brothers, and friends. Survivors told their stories to one another. Some spoke of last goodbyes. One woman said softly, "My husband placed me in the boat. He smiled and told me to be strong. That was the last I saw of him." Others spoke of courage. "The band played until the end," one man said. "Their music was the bravest thing on that terrible night." Children asked again and again, "When will father come?" And their mothers could only hold them closer, unable to speak. The Carpathia was no longer just a rescue ship. It had become a ship of mourning. The air was heavy with grief. Every survivor carried the weight of what they had seen. Some stood silently at the rails, staring back at the empty sea, as if expecting the Titanic to rise again. But there was only water, cold and endless. The survivors felt both thankful and guilty, thankful to be alive, guilty that so many others were not. This feeling would stay with them for the rest of their lives. After several days, the Carpathia reached New York City. Crowds gathered at the port, waiting anxiously for news. Families hoped to see loved ones walking off the ship. But many waited in vain, their hearts breaking when they realized the truth. The survivors stepped onto American soil with heavy hearts. They were safe, but their lives were forever changed. Newspapers around the world carried the shocking headlines, "Titanic disaster, over 1,500 dead." The world wept for the greatest maritime tragedy of its time. For years afterward, survivors could still hear the cries of that night in their dreams. The memory of the silence after the voices faded was worse than any nightmare. One woman later said, "I can still hear it, the sound of hundreds of people crying out in the dark, and then nothing." That silence became part of Titanic's story, a silence that history would never forget. The sinking of the Titanic was not only the loss of a ship. It was the loss of dreams, families, and futures. It was also the beginning of a mystery that would live on for generations. The survivors carried the story in their hearts, while the world asked questions. How could such a great ship sink? Could more lives have been saved? And what lessons must humanity learn? The long silence of that night would echo through history. When the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, the news spread across the world like fire. It was the age of telegraphs and newspapers, and soon every city knew the tragedy. People could hardly believe it. "The unsinkable ship has sunk," they asked in disbelief. How could the largest, safest, most luxurious ship in history disappear in only a few hours? The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a symbol of modern technology, human pride, and progress. If even Titanic could sink, what else in life was truly safe? Soon after the disaster, investigations began in both America and Britain. Officials wanted to know the truth. Why did the Titanic strike the iceberg? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why did so many lives have to be lost? Survivors were called to testify. Crew members described the panic, the courage, and the confusion. Passengers told stories of love, sacrifice, and mistakes. The world listened, shocked and angry. One lesson was clear: rules of safety had to change. After the disaster, the Titanic rested on the ocean floor, for kilometers, about 2.5 miles, below the surface. No diver or machine in 1912 could reach such depths. For decades, the ship was lost in silence, hidden in the cold darkness of the Atlantic. People wondered, what did the wreck look like? Was the ship still whole, or had it broken apart? Would it ever be found? The Titanic became a legend. Books, poems, and songs were written about it. Movies and plays tried to capture its story. For many, the Titanic was no longer just a tragedy, it was a mystery that called out across the years. In 1985, more than 70 years after the sinking, a team led by Dr. Robert Ballard finally discovered the wreck of the Titanic. Using special underwater cameras and robots, they sent images back to the world. The pictures shocked and amazed people. There was the great ship, lying silently on the ocean floor. The bow was still recognizable, standing proud even in death. The stern was broken and twisted, evidence of the terrible way the ship had split apart. Scattered across the seabed were shoes, bottles, plates, and pieces of furniture. Each object told a story of someone's life, suddenly interrupted. The world watched in wonder. The Titanic was real again, not just a story in books, but a ship we could see with our own eyes. Since the discovery, many missions have visited the wreck. They have brought back objects from the ship, jewelry, dishes, letters, and clothing. These items are displayed in museums around the world. Visitors look at them with quiet respect. A child's shoe, a gold watch, a handwritten letter, each one is a voice from the past, whispering of that terrible night. Some people believe the wreck should be left untouched, as a grave for those who died. Others say it is right to recover items, so the world will remember and learn. Whatever the opinion, one truth is clear: the Titanic still lives in human memory. The Titanic began as a dream, became a tragedy, and ended as a legend. It sank beneath the sea, but it rose into history. And so, every time we speak of it, every time we read or listen to its story, we remember the people who lived, who loved, and who were lost on that cold April night. The Titanic is gone, but its story will live forever. Thank you for listening to the story of the Titanic. I hope it helped you practice your English listening and vocabulary. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more English learning stories. See you in the next lesson.